Welcome to part 3. This is our final part on the topic, was it Ishmael or was it Isaac that was sacrificed according to the Quran and the Hadith. So we're going to continue in this segment, in this final segment, we're going to get to the bottom of the evidence. Because like I said, when we do Facebook debates, we can thoroughly investigate and research the matter. So when a Christian presents information, we can go back and check its isnad, whether it's historical context, whether it is fabricated information or whether it actually holds some value. So in this episode, we're going to go into the details because we do have an Arabic speaker. His name is Brother Abdullah Yusuf, and thankfully he understands Arabic, so we can actually check the narrations of what the Christians are presenting. So remember, Robert brings up how, Book al-Tabari, and he tries to use that as evidence to say, it mentions Isaac. Well, we actually asked him to bring the chain of narrations, and Robert says, and look at this. Remember, he was acting all cocky at the beginning, saying, look, I have this hadith. Just like you have a hadith, I have a hadith to show it was Isaac. And he quotes al-Tabari. Well, we asked him to bring us the isnad, the chain of narrators. Robert says, because I don't have access to it, you know this. So he understands that because he doesn't understand Arabic, he doesn't have access to check whether what Tabari mentioned, whether its isnad was actually authentic or not. And Robert says he's limited. Well, that's our point. Why are you entering into a debate? Why are you entering into a discussion when you can't even check the references that you are quoting, whether they are authentic or not? You can't even confirm it for yourself. So why do you engage? And it's interesting, remember earlier in part 2 of the video, he was demanding us to give something from Bukhari and Muslim instead of quoting al-Hadith reference where we showed it was Ishmael. Robert says, you need to give me something from Bukhari and Muslim. And yet now, he doesn't even quote from Bukhari and Muslim, he's trying to use Book al-Tabari as his defense. So notice the double standards. He tries to say to us, the hadith we presented, its chain of narration is broken, it's not as authentic. And he says, give me something from Bukhari and Muslim. Yet he himself doesn't give anything from Bukhari and Muslim. He relies on al-Tabari, and he didn't even check that its chain was broken, wasn't authentic, and it basically didn't even provide a chain of narration, an isnad. Robert then comes back and says, I have to trust what Tabari is recording. I cannot be certain. Also, it is not my job to check those narrations, as you yourself know. You guys are demanding very much. My response to him is, so when we bring a source, it can't be trusted unless it is Sahih Muslim or Sahih Bukhari, but you can go and try and trust things outside Bukhari and Muslim. Look at his logic. Roberto says, when I usually quote hadith, I use either Bukhari or Muslim, plus Tabari is just a historian and a scholar according to your sheikhs. And my response to him is, yes, we all usually quote Bukhari and Muslim, but there is no reason why we can't go outside that. It's you who tried to impose that we only conflate it to Sahih Bukhari and Muslim when you knew we had a hadith elsewhere. But when you went running along other places to look as well, you had no issue in accepting sources outside Bukhari and Muslim. A Christian tried to say, we had a problem of them quoting modern scholars. And Chris says, this post is hilarious. Robert has been smashed because he used modern scholarship, but that's all Muslims use. Muslims never quote Trinitarian scholars to Christians, but demand we quote Sunni scholars to Sunnis. He says the hypocrisy is real. And I said, yes, we all usually quote Oh, sorry, I said to Chris, we encountered his modern scholars with other modern scholars, like, say, Shabir Ali, who was actually against Hamza Yusuf. Robert, and I basically said we encountered his modern scholars with modern scholars. I actually do quote Trinitarian scholars myself. You can actually go to my YouTube video. Most of my work is actually quoting Trinitarian scholars. Robert then says, dude, I thought you had tons of hadith regarding Ishmael. You quoted one hadith which is debated, like Radush said. So it still questions the authenticity, right? Even if your Muslim sheikh deemed it Hasan or Sahih. Our response is, it's still a hadith that's classified Sahih by a scholar to the least, because the hadith that we presented, although some scholars may have disagreed to the authenticity, it was still classified as Sahih by at least a scholar, a classical scholar. And I said, on the contrary, you have no Tabari hadith that has been actually classified Sahih in its isnad, not even by a single scholar. And it's interesting because a hadith we presented, Robert Slivo, he wants to put it into Sunni.com to check its authenticity for himself, but he doesn't even realize it's actually in Arabic. It hasn't been translated into English, all the isnads and all the narrations, and he basically wants to check it on Sunni.com. And I basically said to him, you go do your own research and then we'll do part 3 of the video. So these Christians are wanting the isnad and the proof and the evidence for our hadith. They want to check it for themselves to see whether it's authentic or has it been classified authentic. They want to check the narration. So now what we're doing is we're battling the hadith that we presented in part 2 of the video. And now we're weighing that up against the isnad and the chain of narrations, apparently according to his narration that mentions Ishaq, according to book Tabari. So we have al hadith, and now we're challenging up against his. So they asked for the narration, and Brother Abdullah Yusuf, he posts the narration. As you can see, read it in the text so it's all clear that it's there. It says, read the sanad, it's sahih, each and every single narrator. So it's Ahmed extent, the number is 2707, the full hadith with his isnad, and Matin was Ishmael first. So it mentions Ishmael to be the one that was supposed to be sacrificed. And as you can see, Brother Abdullah Yusuf, he posts the actual hadith there. Brother Abdullah shows that this narration clearly mentions it was Ismail. Hazrat Ismail was wearing white robe. Then Hazrat Ibrahim stepped ahead to slaughter him. A voice from the heaven came and said, you made your dream true, so your sacrifice is accepted. Robert then tries to counter this by saying, it is said by some that Ibn Hanbal made a comment in regard to this book which reads as follows, which is from the book that we presented about this book. It says, I have only included a hadith in this book if it had been used as evidence by some of the scholars. Certain Hanbali scholars such as Abdul Faraj ibn al-Jawzawi claimed that the Musnad contains hadiths that are fabricated by interpolation. The narrator jumbling up information, mixing text and authoritative chains, which were said to be 9 hadiths by some or 15 hadiths by others. However, it is agreed that the hadiths that are suspected to be fabricated are not new hadiths that are creations of dubious narrations, imaginations. Fatawa Ibn Taymiyyah, volume 1, page 248. Brother Abdullah Yusuf says, the Musnad Ahmed contains many hadith narrations, and that's why I quoted the whole sanad with the narration, so you won't have a way out of this. Each and every single narration is mentioned above. If there is any fault in the hadith, show me where the narrator is weak. Moreover, every hadith book has weak and fabricated narrations. It doesn't prove anything. It just proves we have to be careful in evaluating hadith by looking at its isnad and checking every narrator. I can assure you hadith from Bukhari which are totally, is even saying that even in Bukhari you can get weak hadiths. This is what the contention is, that just because it's from a book, it doesn't mean that it may not contain a weak narration. It's funny because Brother Abdullah said to Robert, who actually quoted Ibn Jawzi, apparently even in Ibn Jawzi's own book, it contains many mistakes in narrations. His book, Mawzat al-Kabir, in which he mentions fabricated traditions. There were some hadith which are sahih, but he mentions them as fabrications. So again, we have to check ourselves from hadith scholars or of jara or tadil, which hadith is sahih and which is weak. Brother Abdullah continues to say, that's why I quoted the whole sanad of narration so you can tell me which narration is weak, what kind of defect this narration has in the one that we've presented. And here you go. It's actually here in the screen, as you can see. And that's the text. That's the text over there, as Brother Abdullah presented it. And that's the hadith, extent number 2707 in Kushan Ahmed. It's interesting because Roberto says he can't read Arabic, and he says he can't find a single English translation in there. So he says, so actually and Brother Abdullah reminds him and says, do you want us to spoon feed with you? Obviously you have Arabic teachers, you have Arabic Christians, go and consult them and you can come back to us. And he's basically trying to buy time now. It's interesting, Robert was debating this whole issue, yet he doesn't even know who Musnad Ahmed is. Have a look, he says, I didn't even know who Musnad Ahmed was till now. I only know about the most common hadith books which are usually quoted. So this guy enters a discussion, an academic true discussion to find out truth in Islam, and the guy doesn't know one of the most valuable hadith collection books, which is Musnad Ahmed. And you'll see later how he's now humbled himself after trying to claim he's got this whole refutation against why Ishmael is not the elected one. And he's now claiming that he doesn't even know Musnad Ahmed. I mean, can you believe this, folks? Can you believe this? As you can see in the screen, Brother Abdullah, he presents the Sanad and the Arabic. As you can see here, any Arab Christians, you can go and check all this information. We're now presenting this on the screen so you can see for yourself that the hadith is actually authentic. It's got all the information of the sanad and who it was mentioned by, and all the narrators are actually authentic. Interestingly enough, when Robert gets cornered and he gets refuted, he actually tags Mark Bennett to the conversation to give him a helping hand, who is actually another Christian. So Mark Bennett comes and says, Abdullah Yusuf, he's speaking to Abdullah in the text, he says, Abdullah is cherry picking. One version of this hadith from Musnad Ahmed ibn Hanbal, other parallel versions of the same hadith recorded in Tabarani, Tabari, Ibn Kathir, Suyuti, Al-Jawzi, exists outside of that collection that omit the reported claim that the Dahib was Ishmael. This version also adds additional elements omitted from the other versions, example, Abraham racing with the devil and Ishmael being wrapped in his shirt with kafan, and the ransom ram being white, prime and horned, which are of course embellishments that don't exist in the alternative accounts. Why do these discrepancies exist? They were added in an anachronistically in only one version of the account with a particular transmitter. He is therefore responsible. The answer is given by various Islamic scholars. I'll give one example. Shu'aib al-Arnaut said of the Sanad, his men are trustworthy men other than Abu Asim al-Qanawi, and hence contra Abdullah Arnaut did not rank this as sahih but merely as acceptable. Arnaut himself specialized in hadith and studied under Hanafi ulama. Qanawi is also referred to by many other scholars as unknown. His account is the only form that contained these embellishments and was circulated quite widely, and so therefore became more popular than others in the 3rd century AH. Abdullah then responds back to Mark Bennett and says, first of all, Shu'aib al-Arnaut is Majusima belief, like Ibn Taymiyyah. He is not acceptable in any scholarly community of Hanafi scholars. Second point is, if you think I'm cherry picking, I'm gonna post all the hadith on this matter right now, which are sahih and made to the tawattur and is discussed widely among scholars. And the narrators you said Abu Asim al-Qalnawi is unknown. Imam of Hadith, the big giant in this field, the Hadith master, Yahya ibn Mayin Sa'd, Abu Asim al-Qanawi, is Sahih Sikha narrator. See the scan page again. I underlined it. Now quoting Shu'aib Arnaud against Ibn Mayin is just like quoting a rat against a tiger. Ibn Mayin, the grand Imam of Hadith studies. And here it is again. Mark Bennett says, Abdullah Yusuf, then says against Mark Bennett, he says, now you claim this is an addition account. And Abdullah Yusuf says, let me show you more clear hadith which says it was Ishmael. And he shows it here. That's the hadith. Have a look. And you can see it here. And all you can do is just pause it and you can read it for yourself. Pause it and you can read it for yourself. There you have it. Here's a second hadith that Abdullah presented. And again, it clearly says Ishmael. Again, you can pause it and read it for yourself. And here it is again. In this hadith again, Abdullah ibn Abbas said the sacrifice was Ishmael, but Jews said it was Isaac. They are liars. So the quote comes from Ibn Abbas, as you can see here. This is from Ibn Abbas that mentions it was Ishmael. And here is another hadith that mentions it was Ishmael. Clear. So it's not just one hadith. Here, hadith number 4039. Here's another one. And remember how Mark Bennett was saying how, there are different narrations with differences in the wording and so forth. Therefore, we can't accept it as authentic. Abdullah Yusuf says, let's refute you more on this issue. The narration you are trying to quote from another musnad is this one. For Ibn Abbas, the messenger of Allah said, Gabriel has gone to the ember of Aqada and he has offered him the devil and has given him the 7 stones. He fled with the 7 stones. And then he came up with the maximum ember and he gave him the devil and he threw it away. And I was afraid why Abraham wanted to slaughter his son, Isaac. He said to his father, Father, trust me, I have panicked. It turns out you're my blood if you lie to me. His failure when he took the blade and he wanted to slay him, we performed from behind him. O Abraham, believe this vision. This is in Ahmed 2794. So basically Mark Bennett tried to say that in the same book, Musnad Ahmed, it had another hadith that mentions Isaac and not Ishmael. However, this narration has a narrator, and you can see the narrator here, as you can see in the screen, just over there. His memory got so weak that the scholars said that he don't even know which of the part of the hadith to quote properly. That's why the narrator gets weak, and that's why in his narration we got injected other words. So as you can see, the hadith scholars have actually classified that particular hadith weak in Musnad Ahmed, which actually mentions Isaac, and they've shown the reasons to it, why, and you can see it all here. It's quoted in the Arabic. Here we go. I'm not going to read all the narrations, but you can pause the screen and read it for yourself about why they've classified it weak. This narration has a narrator. His memory got so weak that the scholars said that he didn't even know which of part of the hadith quote properly. That's why the narration gets weak, and that's why in his narration we get injected words, and you can read it here. You can see in Tanzih Perfection 2086, Ahmed bin Abdullah said, "He was an old man of confidence, visions of my father's son, and those who heard from him in the old days. As for anyone who heard from him, a seamer, he is a troubled and one, them crushing." And Khalid ibn Abdul Alawasi, "But the tender of the seamer would have been received if he had spoken, because it was not good for the book." And you can read the rest of the quote for yourself. Just pause the screen and you can read the rest here, why they give their reasons to the weakness of the actual hadith. Apparently the narrator's memory got so weak that it was also mentioned by Imam Dahabi, as you can see here. And again, you can pause the screen. I'll go down, you can read it for yourself. And we can continue to read all of the information. You can pause it and just read it for yourself. Abu Hatim said it was an old truth before he was mixed up, and then he changed his wallet in a lot of talk, and that this son told him was wrong and distributed. He raised things he was saying about the followers, he raised it to the Sahaba. The woman said, "Trust in his old talk," but he changed, and the spirit of Hamad ibn Zayd, the vision and the ambassadors are good. Humayd about Sufyan said, "You heard from the old tender. He gave us the introduction, and I heard it happen and somewhat heard and took it out and I took." So Robert says, "Is he a student of this narrator?" And Abdullah says, "I posted this whole biography above and how he lost his memory." Mark Bennett then comes back and says, "I see you have got spamming tendency." He says, "I know you guys get excited, but you need to calm down and be less emotional. The abuse and emotions are not required. It's just a chat. Don't lose your peace. Don't talk a conversation personally." He says, "I am not discussing any other sanad except those relevant to the original narrator you quoted, and I have documented the problems with it only relevant to the hadith, where the same transmitters are appealed to in other collections. Quoting any random hadith is not a response, as I'm only discussing the one you originally quoted as your evidence. If you wish, we can discuss the rest once you have corrected yourself on the first. Your first attempt to dismiss Al-Arnaut was purely an ad hominem, and neither I or Robert dismiss someone's expertise in hadith and fiqh based on a mere theological position. That would be like Trinitarians dismissing agnosticism, atheists, Unitarians, whether Jewish, Christian or Muslim, scholarship of the Bible, because he is Unitarian, which is altogether a different field of expertise that is a classic ad hominem. Now, I noticed you said that Al-Arnaut would be approved of by a Hanafi community, which was not my claim. My claim was merely that he trained under them. Now, if Ibn Ma'in said he was a big giant in this field, please show us the status among the early scholars, his widespread reputation, and circulated and popularized, and numerous later scholars writing books about him. And please show your views are the consensus, as I pointed out before. Numerous modern scholars, that is, experts trained in the field, attest to the dubious appeal to him. Finally, your straw man me by quoting other hadith by Hanbal, which wasn't my claim. I was referring to his post, and you didn't address my actual argument against trusting Al-Qanawi on the specific relevant content. I mentioned contained in this hadith, you simply ignored it. Some advice. If you are going to have a conversation, don't spam, attack, insult, or get emotional. We are not at Hyde Park. Anyway, okay. So Abdullah responds back to Mark and says, first of all, quote the Shu'aib al-Arnaut comments in Arabic on the narration first, and show me from the early scholars the narrators you claim to be unknown is actually unknown because the earliest scholars Yahya ibn Ma'in verified him. If you don't know about Yahya ibn Ma'in biography, then clearly you don't know hadith scholars, because he is the earliest scholar who made principles on hadith sciences. The hadith you were referring to was in Ibn Qasir and others, was the same hadith in Musnad Ahmed. You didn't provide the sanad for it all. Still, I looked it up and found it similar wording and similar narrations, and quoted Ibn Hajar and Ibn Zahabi and tons of other scholars on the narrator who lost his memory. So don't ignore all the facts I've provided. Brother Abdullah then continues to say, I didn't strawman you. You yourself said there is similar narrations just like this in Ibn Qasir. And Suyuti quoted it, so I typed the similar sanad in Shamaliya and found the narration in Musnad, the same narration that Suyuti and Ibn Qasir quoted, you claim, and that the same hadith has the narrator who lost his memory. That's why the narrator and different wording, so don't ignore the fact. You said don't reject somebody because of theological positions. This is a principle. The person who has some theological beliefs is to be rejected. Why? Because he will have his own agenda in hadith sciences. When regarding hadith sahih or zaif and Shu'aib al-Arnaut is not acceptable in scholarly community, Hanafi, Shafi, Hanbali, Maliki. None of them accepted him. The grand debater of Salafi scholars, Umar Siddiq, even rejected him. So how can you quote such an authority? Yahya ibn Ma'in is from Muttaqimeen, the earliest scholars who laid out principles on hadith, studied, and I'm shocked you are asking me for his biography. Brother Abdullah then says, read Zakaratul Hufaz by Imam Dhahabi to see who was Yahya ibn Ma'in, the earliest scholar of hadith. Criticism who laid principles of criticizing hadith is Yahya ibn Ma'in. Read Tariq Baghdad by Khatib Baghdadi, in which he called Yahya ibn Ma'in the grand hadith master. Quote the Arabic words of Shu'aib Arnaut on the narration provided. Now quote me an authority who approved Shu'aib al-Arnaut as Siqa ibn Hadith studies. Brother Abdullah continues to say, this is the status of Yahya ibn Ma'in, teacher of the Ahmed ibn Hanbal. Imam Madini is also the Grand Master of Hadith studies And if a person doesn't know about these scholars, then we quickly assume he didn't read basic of hadith criticism. And I actually had to interject here because if I understand correctly, Mark Bennett was suggesting there are variants in the hadith and that it didn't mention all the other details and left them out, and some of them even said Isaac instead of Ishmael. This is coming from a Christian who accepts that the four Gospels are as authentic, yet all four Gospels don't match up exactly. Gospel of John, for example, will mention stories about Jesus, not found in Mark's Gospel, but the Christians will happily say they all are authentic and that the Gospel of John was just giving more details to the story than the rest of the other Gospels. But if the Hadith does the same, it's questionable, is it? It was interesting because earlier Robert made a claim saying that he trusts historians like Tabari and scholars of sheikhs of the din and things like that. My question to Robert was, Robert, your hopes should first rest on the Quran and the Hadith, then comes to Muslim scholars. I'd like to also mention this Robert wishes to quote modern scholars and bring up people like Shabir Ali and his academia, but have you heard Shabir ever claim he's a muhaddith? Have you ever heard people going to Shabir Ali to prove that a hadith is sound based on Shabir's fatwa? No. Shabir himself always refers to people in muhaddith authority to classify something authentic. Because Robert tried to earlier go to people like Shabir Ali to say that book Al-Tabari that mentions Isaac was authentic or something like that. I believe Mark Bennett said along the lines that, do we have to refer only to Muslim scholarship? This is interesting. If we Muslims quote people like Bar Ehrman, we get attacked because he's an agnostic. Anyway, we don't really have a problem of quoting non-Sunni scholars, but when you do, because they brought up non-Sunni scholars as well, and they also even brought some non-Muslim ones as well. We don't really have a problem of quoting non-Muslim scholars, but when you do, you need to prove they are a hadith scholar. That is very, very important. You can't just quote some modern scholar said this and said that when that's not the hadith standard. That is not the hadith criticism standard. You need to quote a hadith scholar. It's as simple as this, folks. We have already established that there are giant scholars of muhaddith, as Brother Abdullah mentioned, in Islam, who have classified the hadith sound, and that's the hadith that we presented. If there are other objections, say other narrations of hadith, that is irrelevant. Unless you can provide that there is an explicit narration that mentions Isaac and a muhaddith scholar has said that hadith is also sound. However, we have shown you giant scholars who have spoken on the contrary to them. Then we are ready to close our mouths if you can actually prove the contrary, showing a sound, credible muhaddith hadith scholar who actually approves of the narration that you've mentioned. The fact is, neither do we have such a hadith with an authenticated stamp by a scholar. If you do produce it, then we are going to stick with the best available evidence, that being a hadith that mentions Ishmael, not Isaac, and it has been at least classified sound, regardless if other imams or teachers dispute it. On the other hand, what do you have? Nothing. Just this sheikh said this and that sheikh said that. You have no hadith that's been authenticated to even contend against our hadith. Let me spell it out. You need a hadith to counter a hadith. You don't use sheikh to counter a hadith. First principle is hadith against hadith. You have none. Robert tried it but failed with the quote in Tabari. Like I said, bring us not a sheikh, rather a hadith first. Only then you show a muhaddith to back up your hadith up. Well, you haven't done any of that. Until you do, only then you have a credible argument. Otherwise, it doesn't have full weight against our source that we've actually presented. This is interesting. This question is actually addressing Robert. One other point, I find it equally funny that Robert continues to argue it's all in Arabic, therefore he himself cannot verify it. How about go ask people like Christian Prince or Al-Fadi? It's funny that if you visit Christian Princess's website, this is Investigate Islam, he constantly quotes, I think his page is closed down, he's opened up Muhammad Tube or some other platform. But if you went to his original website and his quotations, and you can even go to some of his YouTube videos that actually just quote things in Arabic, the Christian audience don't have a problem with that. They don't complain and say, well, we can't read Arabic, therefore we can't trust what Christian Prince says. No, they close their eyes and accept what he says. But when it comes to Muslims quoting things in Arabic, it suddenly becomes problematic. Brother Abdullah continues to debunk Mark Bennett and says, Mark Bennett also said to Brother Abdullah, he said, apparently Brother Abdullah was quoting some random hadith to make a point. Abdullah says he's totally wrong in making this assumption. This is the same hadith recorded in Musnad with other hadiths which I've provided, and we've gone through them. We've showed them in the screen. Mark Bennett then claimed that the hadith with parallel accounts similar to this are there, so I quoted the hadith from Musnad Ahmed, which is parallel account narrated from Ibn Abbas. But to show you how weak the narration is, I quoted Zahabi and Ibn Hajar and all other hadith scholars on it. Then you accuse me of spamming. Quoting hadith scholars on a weak narrator is spamming? You claim Shaib al-Arnaut theological belief should not be seen because he was a hadith scholar. Can you show me who approves his scholarly work? Quote me some authority who approves Shaib al-Arnaut in scholarly community. Shaib al-Arnaut was even banned in Syria from giving lectures because of his blunders and beliefs. Moreover, I provided Yahya ibn Ma'in, which clearly graded the narrator Siqa Sahih. Then you start asking me about Yahya ibn Ma'in. At least first you should study the basic principles of hadith criticism and hadith scholars first, then you should talk to people that hadith is sahih. Mark Bennett then asked, why aren't you accepting Shaib al-Arnaut's? And Brother Abdullah says, now to answer your question about why I'm not accepting Shaib al-Arnaut's criticism, because he criticized the hadith, al-hadith in Musnad Ahmed, because the first principle of hadith criticism is that the jara of fasid is not acceptable at all. Shaib al-Arnaut is not accepted in any scholarly community. How his jara is mufassir. Ibn Hajar mentions the usul of criticism in Nukabatul Fiqh. Ibn Hajar says, number 1, jara should not be on theological gain. 2, jara of fasid is not acceptable. 3, jara of non-hadith master is not acceptable. And much more rules for criticism on narrator. What kind of authority does Shaib al-Arnaut have on Yahya ibn Ma'in? Mark then comes back and he says, in reference to Brother Abdullah, he completely misunderstood my post for the second time. Either I'm not writing clearly, so it's my fault and I think this is possible, or he is not grasping it. It's all good. And he basically says, have fun. Interestingly, Mark wants to engage with me because I've made a few points against Mark on this issue. Mark writes to me and says, I think we've had this conversation in the past, but maybe you've forgotten me or my position. And Mark is obviously a non-Trinitarian Christian and he doesn't believe that the Bible is authentic. Not all of it anyway. He says, the problem you mentioned with the Gospels are spot on. I don't think they are inerrant and I don't think they are fully authentic. That would be historically literally impossible. In fact, I don't know any scholar who thinks this other than maybe ultra-conservative evangelicals or apologist types, even the mainstream conservative evangelists like Craig Evans, Mike Lincoln, believe the Gospels contain errors, contradictions, additions, omissions due to various reasons. Example, the genre, telescopic composition, writing style. I am not conservative. I view myself as liberal, moderate. I even agree with Ehrman that the historical Jesus cannot be drawn from the gospel without applying the historical method. When we read each gospel respectively, what we are reading primarily is a theological portrait of every individual author who all have varying, unique views of Jesus. And we know many events reported have less historical precedence from gospel to gospel. Often the information is edited and compacted in accordance with theological paradigm. Rather than reporting the direct speech of Jesus, I don't see the problem with applying high criticism to religious literature, whether the Gospels or the Hadith. Do you? So he's basically, in order to discredit our Hadith, he's basically trying to concede to say, well, he doesn't even believe his own book is authentic. Completely authentic. And my response to Mark Bennett is, I don't believe I've said the Gospels contradict one another at this particular point. I showed what Christians say in defense of the Gospels. If one Gospel narrates less information on the same topic, they basically say one witness just gave less detailed account than the other. So they argue there is no question on reliability. Because what Mark Bennett tried to do is to say, oh, look, there may be a hadith that mentions Ishmael. However, there are other hadiths that mention Isaac in Musnad Ahmed. And because of this variant reading, he's basically trying to say we need to dismiss it all. So my response to him is, Mark, you didn't apply really anything to our hadith evidence. You basically said one has less information than the other. You did not show a contradiction. Well, you did show how Isaac is mentioned in a hadith, but that hadith was classified clearly weak by the giant hadith scholars. Yes, I do know your position on the gospel, although you sound more honest and fair about them. Your Christian brethren mainstream would consider you a heretic if you said there are contradictions between the Gospels and it's not fully authentic. Most Christians I know say it's all fully authentic after revisions such as the NIV version, or as they say, the earliest MMS they have are still authentic. Mark then responds back to me and says, yes, I know on Facebook, the apologists you interact with scream the loudest, especially because most of them are not familiar with the current scholarship on the Gospels. However, in the academic community, and even just selected the Christians within academia, there are the absolute minority and not mainstream at all, and I mean worldwide, and I'll gladly receive the title heretic, as it doesn't imply much other than my own willingness to contradict the official view, which really only exists in dominant form because the ancestors of many of these Christians historically were politically successful through indoctrination, threats, fear, military oppression, laws, censorship. As for whether the Gospels hadith contradict themselves, when one account has an omission and another has an addition, I do not imply a contradiction. One says X, one says not X. Rather, I implied that an embellishment has taken place in order to advance a more developed theological view that does not exist in the alternative account. That is not an explicit contradiction. That's being honest about one account providing specificity and the other account lacking such specificity. If all the other accounts lack such, then it is clear in this case of the account that does not lack it, that it wasn't part of the original tradition. Remember that. That the variant came from elsewhere. That doesn't mean for Muslims it has no theological value, but it does mean that such views were not made explicit in the early forms of this hadith, and they needed to be tweaked to make sure the narration was towing the party line relevant to the era. And in that case of this hadith, it became popularized in the 3rd century after Hijrah. This version of it is the most well known. After the simple fact is no matter version of the hadith one accepts as a sahih or attributed to Muhammad. There is no historical evidence of the monotheistic Abrahamic existence. There is no evidence of Mecca existed at the time of the alleged Abraham. There is no evidence that the Hijrah was active in Mecca. There is no evidence of Abraham, which there is no evidence of event that he went to Mecca, and he goes on and on and on. Okay. He then says, at Mecca in the area traditional assigned to Abraham, which are all contradictory and still unproven, what we have once again is historical reality versus religious faith, whether Jews, Christians, and Muslims admit it or not. And we have a desire for is Muslims trying to assign their own beliefs, desperately making them traceable to Muhammad despite how flimsy the evidence actually is. In your case, you even have to agree with the methods of ultra-conservative fundamentalist Christians. Apologists' response with you typically would openly be condemned, and that there's no way to do scholarship to concede that the Islamic scholarship on the science of hadith concurs with the fundamental Christian scholarship on the Gospels in areas of methodology. Scope is to begin to point yourself in other directions from these superfluous systems of thought. My response: you said it wasn't part of the original tradition because it lacked other information. Big deal. However, did it lack the main message, that being Ishmael, according to the consensus of hadith, according to the giants of the scholars? Nope. Therefore, it affirms the position of other hadith that have a greater length info. Christians like to say it's okay if there are variances, at least the main message of Christianity is not affected. So I'll apply the same standard. It's okay if there are variances. The main message that it was Ishmael is not affected, since all the hadith in question say Ishmael, and the ones that may say Isaac, their hadith is classified weak by the giants of scholars. It's interesting because even Christian apologists do not dispute the 9-year-old marriage of Aisha, even though many Sahih Hadith accounts have differences in age. Some say 7, others say 6, others say 9. There are even narrations in Book Tabari that suggest she was 10. But Christians are still happy to accept no contradiction here on her age being unreliable. And those contradictions are even more explicit. Then you went on a tangent to say there is no historical evidence of Abraham, Kaaba. So you're going off topic, so I'm not going to entertain you on irrelevance. I can give you things in the Bible like there is no historical evidence of the preserved tablet of the 10 Commandments God gave to Moses. There is no historical evidence of Jesus raising on the third day, which was supposed to be written in the law of Moses, Tanakh, the explicit term on the third day. I can even tell you there is no historical evidence of the existence of Adam and Eve. But I don't know, you will probably say you don't care about this. It is not authentic according to the Bible, so I can't really argue with that. Mark Bennett then responds back and says, your last paragraph and at last sentence I concur that this my point. I'm not trying to force the historical evidence to corroborate with my faith. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes we learn that a lot of it has been distorted and misinterpreted by mainstream churches for so long that it was never intended to be historical or literal in the first place, or we have missed something deeply profound and entirely altogether because of the widespread dominant traditions that you so openly love when it comes to Sunni Islam. And his response to Aisha, he says, I agree the reports are not unanimous on her age. I don't know how old she was. I don't even know if she existed. What is distributed, however, it is because so many Muslims believe those reports are authentic. You have the scholarly and political harmony in Islamic nations implementing child marriages laws based on testimonies and so forth, according to earliest traditions. He says, your first paragraph, I think you misunderstood my point. I didn't express it clearly enough. When I mentioned an almost word-for-word hadith, this includes some of the same sanad from the one referenced by Abdullah and myself. So, for instance, the same transmitter Hamad also appears in Hanbal's narration referenced by Abdullah. In every other report, instance of this narration outside of Hanbal's collection is reported as narrated the Ishaq view. The difference that occurs in this hadith is when Hamad in Hanbal's collection quote the Ishmael view via Ghanami, if all the other accounts lack such, then it is clear in this case of the account that does not lack it, that it wasn't part of the original tradition, that the variant came through Ghanawi, as there is no other hadith outside of Hanbal's collection that has his version of it. Hamad, when reporting the same matin in other various collections, never mentions Ghanawi as a transmitter or Ishmael as the sacrifice. There is absolutely no way reasonable to call this Sahih unless you are severely biased. Conservative Islamic apologist scholars, so Muslims can appeal to a conservative fundamental Islamic scholarship all they want, just like Christian fundies can, to explain away various embellishments and differences, but no thanks for me. I'll just take the most sound approach, which allows for openness and honesty at best, explanation of such discrepancies to prevail, instead of constantly reinterpreting anything and everything in light of the dogmatic conservative paradigm. My response to Mark. Great to know he doesn't believe in the young marriage of the Prophet Muhammad, because according to the belief, the hadith have variances on the age. Interesting. I wonder how well that would go with other Christians. You may classify it weak hadith because it shows variance, or on the narration or variances. Science of hadith still allows weak hadith to be accepted, so long as it doesn't contradict authentic hadith or the Quran. So we can still use a hadith that is weak, even if you classify it as such. And like I said in my original point, which you ignored, it doesn't matter if there are variances as long as the main message is not affected. You use that same application for Christianity. Mark then responds back by saying, correct, brother, maybe 10 years ago or more, when he claims he was an evangelical, he said he would argue that, he disagrees with the Prophet Muhammad's marriage, and so forth, because of the young marriage. He says, yes, I understand that in Islamic context that a weak hadith and even sirah and tariqah to some extent can be taken as long as it doesn't contradict the Quran and other sound hadith. I do concur that this is the Islamic methodology. However, by historical standards taught in Western universities, this doesn't infer its historical reliability. Christians quite often have taken the church fathers as authoritative, in the same sense when they tell us something purportedly historical about Jesus or the apostles. I invite you and every Christian and Muslim to transcend such traditions that favour their own in-group biases and come to be more objective in your research, inshallah. He's now speaking Arabic. Or at least to do what I do and call it a spade a spade. This is faith, not a court of law, trialing the Christian God and the Muslim God, empirical evidence. And my response to him is, well, its weakness is disputed regarding the hadith that we presented. So it's not as though there is a consensus, it's only weak. You appeal to Western scholarship, which is better, yet you consider to accept the main message of Christianity is not affected, even though the main message comes out of an authentic book like the Bible. So how did you not break your own premise with that logic? See, Mark Bennett still dogmatically accepts that Jesus rose and was crucified, and, he basically believes in that. Yet that teaching can be dogmatic through the church as well. He went in to prove that all of these hadith have variances and that we shouldn't accept the main message, and the main message is Ishmael. There is a consensus on that. So why then does he break his own standard, and throughout all of the variances of the Bible, he still accepts the main message, which is the resurrection and the crucifixion of Christ? I mean, do you see the double standards now? Now, Brother Abdullah comes back to debunk Mark Bennett's initial last point, where he was trying to make claims about the narration of Hanbal and so forth, and his objections to that. And Brother Abdullah comes back to respond. And Brother Abdullah says, Mark Bennett is absolutely wrong. How can you approach hadith studies without the hadith scholars who laid out the principles? What kind of principles you have when you approach hadith studies? If you don't follow those principles, then you have no case at all, because this field of hadith science is made by these scholars. You can't invent your own principles, such as Western scholars. You can't invent your own principles and reject it into the hadith science, which to me and all the scholars community is a blunder. Nobody is going to take you seriously on anything you invent in your own principles, instead of following Muslim hadith scholars who made this science. I understand how in the world a hadith can get weak just because the other narrations are there, but the narrator is not there. What kind of principle, where did you look this principle from? Can you name me? Which book you read this principle? First of all, the narrator you claim to be unknown is now unknown, will post his biography and kunyat from Rijal books. So the whole big claim of Shoaib Arnaud is actually bluster and ignorance of the fact that this narrator is found in many Rijal books with biography. Even Ibn Hajar mentions him, and hadith scholars consider him to be sahih. Then how in the world this hadith is weak when there is no narrator who makes it zaif? Here, Brother Abdullah quotes from from Lisan al-Mizan Ibn Hajar. How in the world he is unknown? He is mentioned in Rijal book Lisan al-Mizan first, as you can see here. Brother Abdullah then says to Mark Bennett, the same narrator is mentioned in all of the Rijal books, and kunyat and biography is mentioned. In how many books this narrator is mentioned and biography and lineage is mentioned? 1. Lisan al-Muzin, 2. Taqrib al-Taqrib, 3. Tazib al-Tazib, 4. Jara al-Taddil, 5. Mizan al-Aital. These are the biggest famous Rijal books to look up. Rijal in Hadith books, all of these books mentioned him. How in the world he is unknown, and from which principle or criteria that Hadith is zaif? To call a Hadith zaif, you must have a solid reason and a solid ground to call it Hadith daif. In this Hadith, not a single narrator is weak. The reference is here. Nowhere is it weak. You can see all the references there. Mark Bennett then says that it was an unknown narrator and things like that, according to all the Muslims and so forth. And Brother Abdullah says, this is the Rijal of Sahih Muslim. The narrator you claim to be unknown is the narrator who narrate Hadith in Sahih Muslim. Just explain to me how in the world this narrator is unknown, who is Rijal of Muslim Sharif. And as you can see here, Mark Bennett, this is clear. Tosib of the narrator, Imam Zahabi, Imam Hajar, Imam Ibn Mayn, the three big Imams, Hadith scientists call him Sika Sahih. Then how this Hadith get weak? Have a look. Then Abdullah says to Mark Bennett, moreover, the Hadith I mentioned, I prove from Rijal books, biography books, it's Sahih, and narrator is 100% trustworthy. Hadith scholar mentions him, he is Sahih. On the other hand, you claim that there are other narrations. Now, am I going to post those narrations which have similar matan and wording? Which Hadith scholar themselves claim Zaif? First narration is Zaif, reference. Let's have a look. Because the Imam Sufi mentions him clearly Zaif because of his memory. This is the same narration whose matan is similar to the narration I gave as proof. So, but Mark Bennett's one, as you can see, his one is Daif, where L1 is authentic. Have a look. You can pause it and read it for yourself. Show your Arab Christian friends. The same narration is mentioned here in other narrations. Have a look. And finally, Mark Bennett said that the narration, Mark Bennett, the narration you claim doesn't contain, as you can see here, the narration you claim doesn't contains, and he is lost his memory. He is extremely weak in narrating hadith. On the other hand, the hadith I provided is sahih. So this apparent person, Gunani, this person narrator you claim doesn't contain. Gunani contains, and he has lost his memory. He is extremely weak in narrating hadith. On the other hand, the hadith I provided is sahih. The hadith scholars considered sahih, and the narrator you claim is unknown, is well known by hadith scholars, and they consider him sahih. Then there is no reason to call a hadith daif. On what basis you are calling it daif? Just because the text of the hadith is different? Yes, because the texts of the hadith are different because they contain, and that's the Arabic, who has a weak memory and couldn't narrate hadith properly. Calling a hadith weak just on the criteria is also wrong. No Usul ul Hadith book on earth mentions any such principle. Where did you get this principle from? So now you are gonna invent your own principles. What kind of scholarship is that? And how anybody is going to take you seriously if you're going to do this thing again? So that's it, folks. That was the end of part 3, where we completely debunked the Christians and showed them that the narration they brought up is being classified weak. It has no isnad in Book al-Tabari. The narration that they brought up in Musnad Ahmed showing a variance mentioning Isaac, we've shown that that was classified weak by the giants of hadith. On the other hand, al-hadith, as Brother Abdullah presented, to prove Ishmael, that has been classified authentic by the giants of hadith, and its chain of narration has been proven sahih, when in fact their claimed hadith scholar, who wasn't a hadith scholar, who wasn't even accepted by any of the muhaddith, any of the schools of thoughts, Mark Bennett tried to say that that particular scholar defended that it was Isaac. We've now shown that he wasn't a hadith scholar, and he was not part of the scholarly consensus to be understood and accepted among their scholarship and circle. So there you have it, folks. So now you think who has the stronger weight of the table. So clearly we've debunked the Christians on this. Alhamdulillah, that Ishmael is the one definitely that was to be sacrificed.